You're listening to international investment advisor Doug Goldstein on the Goldstein on Gelt show, the financial show where we'll talk about how you can make the most of your money. With all the confusing financial chatter bombarding you each and every day, Goldstein on Gelt will give you the practical information you want and need about living a financially stable life. Here's your host, money maven Doug Goldstein.
Okay, we are back. We are talking to Scott Stevens, who is a professor of Computer Information Systems and Management Science at James Madison University. He was chosen as the Distinguished Teacher of the College of Business in 2009 and has 5 times been named Outstanding Teacher of the Year by students at the James Madison University undergraduate business program. So, Professor Stevens, it is certainly a pleasure to have you on the show today.
Thank you very much.
So your topic is game theory. Could you tell us, first off, what is game theory? And they're always talking about prisoners. Who are those prisoners that the game theorists are always talking about?
It is. It's a very famous game theory problem that came up with two men named Flood and Drescher back in the 1950s. It was the prisoner's dilemma version of it came a little later, but the idea was that you have two individuals who have together committed a crime, and if they've been put into 2 separate rooms, if they each rat out the other person, then there's enough evidence to put them both away for a good long time, usually something like 3 years. If only one rats on the other, then the one who rats gets to go free, while the one who was ratted on is put away for like 5 years. But if they both keep their mouths shut, then they're both locked up for like a year. So if you think about it, the obvious thing is we'll both stay quiet, and in doing so, we'll both only get 1 year. Except that no matter what you do, it's better for me to rat you out. If you're going to rat me, I get 3 years rather than 5, and if you're going to be quiet, I get 0 years rather than 1. So no matter what you do, it's better for me to betray you, and you reason the same way. So we both betray, and we both go to jail for 3 years when we could have both gone for 1.
I see. So how is this a psychological problem, or is this a question of logic?
It's really a question, it's a real problem in terms of how people should make their best decisions. This particular little game has been a thorn in the side of game theorists for years and years, because it seems like by each person making what seems to be a series of logical, rational steps, that they come to a conclusion which is not just worse for the other person, which is somewhat understandable, but it's worse for everyone. We have a problem like this that occurs on a larger scale with more players. When you take a look at something like, for example, let's say traffic congestion or international fishing. It's better for everybody if we control our fishing and so we keep the sustainable population, but everybody thinks, I'll just do a little more and everybody else can cut back. But no one does that, and so you end up with everybody doing worse off.
Is it similar to the question of why doesn't the government just print a little bit more money?
I suppose it could be tied in with that, but usually in a game like this, we have a bunch of individuals, each acting for on their own self-interest. So it comes up more often in a kind of tragedy of the commons sort of situation, where perhaps there's a resource that we can all take advantage of, and everybody wants to take a little bit more than what's good for the group.
We play an interesting game in my house. I think it might also be a game theory concept, which is when we are serving cake. So we take, do you know this game, right? We take the cake. And
please.
So as the father of the house, I begin, there's 6 people in my family. My wife and I have 4 kids.
Right.
And the cake is not that big, and it's kind of long, and I just begin to move the knife across the cake. And I say, okay, say stop. And when you say stop, whoever says stop, I'll cut the cake at that point. And then he gets that point.
Right.
And then I'll keep moving the knife for the next one. So it's always a challenge. Should you lock in the safety of knowing you've got a piece of cake? Of course, it'll cut off the amount that you may potentially get, but you never know what everyone else is going to do because each person is working for his own self-interest.
You're a wise father, I see.
Well, at least it gets us discussing game theory. How can game theory be used in making personal financial decisions? Is there anything applicable to regular people?
It's interesting. You can kind of look at game theory on 2 different levels. The one level of it is extremely mathematical. We've got a lot of Nobel Prize winners in economics who have actually gotten their rewards for game theory. And so you can look at some fairly sophisticated matters of, markets in which you have imperfect information or non-transferable utility or all sorts of things like that. In real life, day-to-day activities, it's almost always the case that someone's going to make a decision without sitting down, pulling out a piece of paper, and working through the game theoretic calculations of what they should do. But that said, I think that there are a number of basic principles that one can get from game theory that is very useful in making decisions. A couple of them. One of them that really surprised me when I first came across it was that I'm a person who tends to believe in flexibility. I tend to think that if I have more flexibility in a situation, then I have more ways I can respond to that situation, and that puts me in a stronger position. But a man named Thomas Schelling was the one that first really put it very nicely. He said, the power to constrain an adversary depends on the power to bind oneself. And we've all been in situations that are this way. If, for example, you and I are involved in a business deal, and I simply, for one reason or other, cannot afford to drop my price to what you want, then either you go with my price or we don't make a deal. And if my claim that I can't lower my price is credible to you, then I've actually gained by the fact that I've limited my flexibility. Countries do this all the time in their relations with one another, so do companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we've seen this sort of thing in the different type of auctions that a company will have when it's tendering out for a deal, whether they want an auction, let's say, from the bottom up or from the top down, depending.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the structure of auctions is really quite interesting because there's a theorem that says that if everybody plays perfectly, that all auctions on average will generate the same amount of money if they meet some very basic assumptions. But that doesn't factor into some of the variations we've seen in human behavior, which is something that game theory is still coming to grips with. Yeah, a Dutch auction or an English auction or a sealed bid auction can generate different amounts of money, but good auction structure is terribly important. The FCC here in America ended up making about $400 billion in the first 5 years that they implemented an auction system on selling the FCC's airwaves, the radio spectrum, to cell phone companies. Before that time, they had a lottery system, and it was really not very good. In fact, it was weird because virtually anyone could enter it, with the result that, for example, one year, the rights to the cell phone coverage in Cape Cod in Massachusetts went to a group of dentists who, yeah, that was really quite funny, and they were no fools. They turned around and sold it to Southwest Bell for $41 million. So that wasn't the best business plan for the country.
Amazing. We are talking to Professor Scott Stevens, who is a professor of computer information systems and management science at James Madison University. He's a game theory expert, and he's been explaining to us a little bit now about how game theory works. Tell me something, a real live example of this is used to explain, I think you've even explained it, why cigarette companies agreed to stop advertising on TV. How did that work?
Yeah, it's a beautiful example of the problem you brought up earlier of what's called the prisoner's dilemma. Once again, when the prisoner's dilemma occurs when each individual, seeming to make their own best decision, ends up with a situation that's worse for both players than would have been if they had cooperated. With the cigarette companies, the biggest part of their market comes from stealing from other cigarette companies. Their advertisements would generate some new business, but mainly it would be business that you would get from other companies. So if I advertise and you don't, I spend money on advertisement, but I get more than that from the people I steal from you, which is good for me. You, of course, have the same reasoning. The result is we both spend a lot of money on ads, and that means it's basically a wash in terms of stealing from one another. So we have essentially the same people that we had before as customers, but we're making less profit because we're spending money on advertising. When the government said we're no longer going to allow you to advertise cigarettes, for example, on television, the cigarette companies were more than happy to agree with this because it meant that nobody would be wasting their money on ads and they could actually make more money. And frankly, it also did decrease somewhat the number of people who were smoking, so that one's a win-win-win situation, I think.
I gotcha. For people who are normal people, right, not big companies, big international companies, are there game theory day-to-day sort of events that happen that they might see?
Oh, I think they come up all over the place. One of the things that comes up is this matter of sunk cost and how people tend to deal with it. One principle that a lot of people tend to ignore is the way that the decisions that they make are going to influence the decisions that other people make. So a lot of times people will make their decision without thinking that they're actually changing the future in the way that they do it. A game theory principle is that in order to look forward, you have to be able to reason backward. A really great example of this, I think, came up with Max Bazerman from the Harvard Business School. He conducts a number of seminars where he's dealing with Wall Street bigwigs and talking to them about financial decisions and so on. One thing that he often does in his meetings is he will auction off a $100 bill. And, yeah, I know, it's hilarious. And these people are big titans of Wall Street. The rules of the auction are a little weird, though, which goes this way. Whoever bids highest, just like usual, wins the $100 bill. However, whoever made the second highest bid, the last bid that wasn't the winner, also has to pay their bill. Benjamin's done this more than 100 times.
Sorry, the second highest has to pay what?
The second highest bid must also pay whatever they did.
I see, okay.
Okay, which sounds like a really strange structure, but if you think about it, a war of attrition is fought that way, right? I mean, both sides are paying for the war and in treasure and blood until the very end, when somebody goes a little longer than the other side and they win. But both sides end up paying whatever it cost them to conduct the war. In a personal relationship, you can have much the same thing. Benjamin did this, and the $100 bill was auctioned to these Wall Street bigwigs for, you ready? $465.
Holy cow! And that's because
$465.
That's because once they topped $100, then they kept having to bid it up in order not to be the second one, right?
Exactly right. At $95, you're making $5 on the $100. The other person bids $100. If you stop now, you're $95 out. But if you bid $110 and win, you're only $10 out. Unfortunately, the person who bid $100 is now $100 out unless they bid $120. Obviously, somebody is going to get nailed by this. But the bidding by these people went to $465 before someone finally relented.
That's amazing. Wow,
it really is.
The world of game theory certainly sounds like a great world to live in. Professor Scott Stevens, I'd like to thank you very much for spending time with us today.
It's been a pleasure, Doug. Thank you very much.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
You've been listening to the Goldstein on Gelt Show with money maven Doug Goldstein. Doug's weekly radio show is heard around the world, but if you miss it, you can download the podcast at www.goldsteinongelt.com. The Goldstein on Gelt Show gives you up-to-date financial ideas so you can get on the path to financial freedom. If you'd like your questions answered on the air or off, send Doug an email to doug@profile-financial.com. It's your money for your future, so join Doug every week to build your wealth on the Goldstein on Gelt Show.